the brown looks good with these too. Oh, yeah, now, see that.
And I love the edge, it's hard to see the.
Oh,
little
yeah,
ripple.
we made that little glimmer.
Yeah. She always takes it home. She's the one that takes it down.
Oh, yeah, it does.
She'll eat it today for lunch.
Chicken. The
Hey,
right.
Jeff.
Yeah, yeah.
You did, you did.
You had some today? Actually,
Yes.
they don't eat much when they know they're gonna eat that at dinner or lunch. Here's your meat, that's all. Oh, yeah. So then just bring it back tonight.
Okay.
Surprise yourself.
I didn't spend that.
Well, I'm gonna wait till I get home.
Yeah, and then just bring it back tonight, because I think she needs it back for school.
Okay.
I only count till now.
Joanne, Joanne.
That's all that matters.
Oh, both of them?
Yeah.
So I need to make two more?
Well, no, just write whatever you want on the page. Yeah.
Will do.
Hey, how are you?
Absolutely.
That's good. That's all that matters. I thought it was a mirage.
It could be, you never know. You never know. No, with everybody, you never know. We're here.
I'm happy because of you.
Yeah. Yeah, my daughter's gonna be here place.
Really?
Oh, is she? Oh, good.
She's changed locations now, so now she's up on, well, Sunday's and Monday, half Saturdays. But, yeah, she's working up in the north instead of way out in the south.
In an ambulance? Did she work in an ambulance?
No, she's been working as a doctor, that was what.
Oh, they're, oh, okay. Yeah.
She's staying with them because, I mean, you know, they've been good to her. They don't want her. So, but yeah, so she was working over there. There are other places, Rainbow, the joint.
Oh, way out.
Yeah, whoa, that's well. And then the north is off of there, 95 area. And so, like I said, they love her both places. But we don't have that, because Cody is not the only person who was not very good. I said, well, you tell them that's fine, you will.
Good morning.
It's not gonna interrupt. Good morning. Yeah, they have the cleaners up there too.
How are you? I said, how are you? Are you good?
She does.
Good.
Good morning.
We all have the same dress. What's my favorite name for you? You're my
Good morning, Jeff.
How are you? What's your favorite name?
Yeah, he's back.
I'm sorry, you're still. You Joe? Can I get rid of it? She's got the book. Oh, so she will read it tonight. Here's, I don't know, my mind changed. Every time I go in here, I get my name. Good. You ask me every time, I don't even remember. You don't remember our name? I guess.
What I need.
See, wow. Guess what I'm gonna say? No. What's your first name? Oh, Kathy. Yes.
My first name?
We're gonna try, and so I look at my bag.
Sue.
So I gotta go concentrate you. Oh, well. I cannot.
His first name is Billy, but you call him Papa. Oh, see. This.
Oh, you all right, Toots?
Careful, babe.
Hey, Goober. They do.
Yeah. Take care of the kids.
That's your teacher.
Oh, yeah. Oh, thank you.
How are you?
Thank you.
Okay, it's going
Well, no.
I know. Well, it's liability. That's the issue.
Oh, stop. I'm like, I'm drinking almost choked. Sorry.
So she's been out.
Well.
That's good. Brian's up there. That's good.
Morning, everyone. Let's invite you to open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 12. Matthew chapter 12. And we'll begin there after a word of prayer. And Scott, could you lead us in an opening prayer?
Father in heaven, thank you for this day. Thank you for letting us come here to learn more about your word. We pray everything said and done here today is according to your will. Forgive us our sins, and just name we pray. Amen.
So in our last few classes, we've kind of worked our way down through Matthew 11, and we had the last couple things that Jesus had faced was this generation who wasn't pleased no matter what kind of message was being brought to them, whether it was Jesus and his good news of the kingdom, whether it was John and his focus on the need for repentance. That either way they had things to criticize about the news they were bringing, how they were bringing the news, what their attitudes were like, and you could see how that would be troubling to Jesus. Here he is bringing such a wonderful thing to people, and yet they're so unreceptive to it. They're very unreasonable in what they criticize, what they're expecting. And then we talked about these cities, the very first cities who were the first ones around the Sea of Galilee to hear this good news, right? We talked about that in our last Sunday morning class, and how they treated it as nothing. They heard Jesus, sure, they came out to see some of the works he was doing, but they were unwilling to repent. They were unwilling to actually take action on the good news. They didn't think of it as something amazing that had come to them, that they were in such a privileged position to be the first to hear this, and how wonderful that would have been. And yet, even they did not respond to it. They didn't take Jesus seriously. And so we kind of see Jesus coming to this point where he's beginning to feel this rejection. Right, he's beginning to see it as we see it being encountered here. We know it's about to get even worse as we go throughout these next number of chapters. But we're seeing the start of it here, and I just find it interesting that after recording those two things, the very next thing that we read about Jesus doing is praying. And praising and thanking God. Right, and that's kind of a weird place to go after being in that kind of position, and that's at the end of chapter 11 there that we studied in our last class, where he begins there in verse 25, where Jesus says, "I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, that you have hidden these things from the wise and intelligent, and have revealed them to infants." I think there's a lot for us to learn there about having that kind of response when maybe things aren't working out well for us. When what we're trying to help people with is met with rejection, is met with unreasonableness, is met with hostility towards us even, that Jesus still finds something in that to be thankful for. And, it may be different things for different people, but I find that example struck me as I was studying through this. And, Chris did a good job in our last class about kind of covering this last section of chapter 11. And there's this invitation that Jesus extends to all. And that kind of brings us to chapter 12, where we read this story about Jesus's being criticized, Jesus and his disciples being criticized for doing necessary things or for doing good things. And this is going to be a pattern that we see repeated over and over throughout our study here in Matthew. And just to begin, let's go ahead and read verses 1 through 8 to get us started. And then I want us to dig into some of these things that we may kind of take for granted that we know about, that we know the significance of, to kind of understand why people would treat Jesus and his disciples this way, and why they might have these ideas in their head that they're always testing him with. And so let's begin by reading verses 1 through 8. And Barry, could you read those for us?
At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his
disciples were hungry and began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. When the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." But he said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests? Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? Yet I say to you that in this place there is one greater than the temple. If you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath."
All right, so again, condemning the guiltless, right? That's kind of what this story is about that we're reading here. It's also what the next story is about, where Jesus is healing the man at hand, is criticized much the same way for doing it on the Sabbath. And what was one of the words that we read about over and over again? What's the one of the words that describes the context of this interaction in the passage we just read? Why did they have a problem with what he was doing? Okay, have you not read, right? So he's referencing back to things they should have known, and things they should have known because what they were criticizing him about was also something that they should have known, right? Which was this idea of the Sabbath and what is and isn't allowed on the Sabbath. And it's easy to kind of, for us to look at that and think, wow, they're being so harsh. Like, why would they be so harsh about something like that? And this is we read this account of this story in both Mark and Luke as well. And we may make just a reference or two back to those as we study this. But before we get into the Sabbath and kind of looking at that and why that would be an issue, why they would be bringing this up and making a big deal over what they were doing on the Sabbath, I want us to also look at what they were doing to begin with. What was it that his disciples were doing as they walked along on this Sabbath day?
They were eating corn.
Okay, eating corn or grain or something, depending on, I know different versions render that in different ways. Right, so they were picking something out of a field, right, and eating it, right? Why were they doing that?
They were hungry.
Because they were hungry. Wouldn't that be stealing? Was it their field?
No,
Chris?
there's a law back in Deuteronomy. In fact, it's Deuteronomy 23, 25. It says that if you're in a neighbor's field, you can pluck their green and eat it. You just can't harvest it.
Right. Yeah, you can't take a big batch with you. Okay. So let's go ahead and read Deuteronomy 23 verses 24 and 25, and I'd encourage everyone to turn there because we're going to look at another passage in Deuteronomy as well. Deuteronomy 23. And Chris, if you're there, can you read verses 24 through 25?
Deuteronomy 23, 24, and 25. When you come into your neighbor's vineyard, you may eat your fill of grapes at your pleasure, but you shall not put any in your container. When you come into your neighbor's standing grain, you may pluck the heads with your hand, but you shall not use a sickle on your neighbor's standing grain.
Wow, that's pretty nice, isn't it? Like, that sounds like a nice place to live, where you could do something like that. And it amazes me when you look back, because there are other laws that exist at this time of all the neighbors of Israel when this was given. There were other laws. A lot of the laws that you read about Israel having were shared by countries that or by other nations, other communities that had their own set of laws that in some ways were very close to what Israel had. But there is nothing like this. Nothing that allowed that was meant to benefit those who were poor, who were needy, that took care of them like God's law to Israel took care of the poor and the needy. And that's what this law did. These laws that we read about here are benefiting the poor. They're not an excuse for theft, right? Like we read there, and like Chris brought up, this isn't to go and put a sickle to their thing and take a bunch for yourself. No, this is to care for those who are hungry, who needed to eat. And so while we're in Deuteronomy, let's just turn back to Deuteronomy 15, because this passage always just really touches me and is amazing for at the time that this was given to these people, what it was like to live in the world. This is completely flips that on its head. This completely flips the way the poor, the needy were treated. And in Deuteronomy 15, let's go ahead and read verses 4 through 11. Deuteronomy 15, 4 through 11. And Brittany, can you read that for us?
However, there will be no poor among you, since the Lord will surely bless you in the land which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance to possess, if only you listen obediently to the voice of the Lord your God, to observe carefully all this commandment which I am commanding you today. For the Lord your God will bless you as he has promised you, and you will lend to many nations, but you will not borrow, and you will rule over many nations, but they will not rule over you. If there is a poor man with you, one of your brothers, in any town in your land which the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart, nor close your hand from your poor brother, but you shall freely open your hand to him, and shall generously lend him sufficient for his need in whatever he lacks. Beware that there is no base thought in your heart, saying, the seventh year, the year of remission, is near, and your eye is hostile toward your poor brother, and you give him nothing. Then he may cry to the Lord against you, and it will be a sin. You shall generously give to him, and your heart shall not be grieved when you give to him. Because for this thing the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in all your undertakings. For the poor will never cease to be in the land. Therefore I command you, saying, you shall freely open your hand to your brother, to your needy and poor in your land.
All right, so this is kind of the basis for so many of the laws, so many of the way their society was organized ties back into this teaching here, this principle of how they were to think about those who had fallen on hard times, how they were to treat and take care of those who were poor, who were needy, right? And you find it interesting, and this is you kind of find contrasts like this as you go throughout the scriptures, especially when talking about Israel. But look how that passage started. It started, but there will be no poor among you. And then look at the last verse that Brittany read there in verse 11. For there will never cease to be poor in the land. Why does God say at the beginning of, why is it written here in the beginning of this? God makes this declaration, there will be no poor among you, but then by the end, he says there will always be poor in the land. Carl and then Chuck.
And this ties in what we studied that applies to us in 1 Timothy, where you're talking about the love of money. He doesn't condemn money. He said he gives us all these things to enjoy. But we're told there not to be stingy. It says willing to distribute. That goes back to the same thing he was teaching about during his whole law. And he also, we studied where it said, the man who used to steal no more, but work with his hands, that he'll have for himself and some to give to the poor. So this carries right through to today. We can't be stingy with what we have.
Right. This is the kind of attitude that reflects God's character, because God does this. Right. God does this in his creation. Chuck.
He says in the last verse, there'll always be somebody in need. Not everybody has what they need at all times. There's always going to be somebody, and we need to help them. If we're able to help them, we need to help them. There's always going to be somebody out there that needs your help.
Yeah, well, right, there will be. And that is, I think, a reason for that, though, is because not everybody lives by this standard. Right? If everybody lived by this, there would be no poor among us. Right? That's the promise that he starts this premise with, is that there will be no poor among you if you will strictly obey what is being this living by this principle, where everybody cares for everyone else. But just like just like Moses did before entering the promised land and giving his talks to the people of Israel, he would tell them what he needed, what they needed to do, how to live, how to be, how to possess this new land and have it be a blessing to them. But he says, I know that you're not going to live up to that. Right. And so there's this constant tension where there's this ideal that's being put out there that has tremendous blessings, right? That would completely change the world if everybody lived by it. But because not everybody is going to live by that, because there are always going to be people who fail at the standards that God sets for them, including all of us. None of us fully live up to what we can be in the Lord. And, for that reason, there will never cease to be poor among us. There will never cease. And specifically here, speaking of Israel, I think there's an element of that ties into this passage and the way that it's constructed there. But either way, we see the principle and why Jesus and his disciples would have felt comfortable picking the heads of somebody else's grain or of their corn or whatever it was as they were walking through their field. It's because there was provision for that, for those who were hungry, those who were needy, which we know Jesus and his disciples often were. And here specifically reading about his disciples being hungry. And we don't have insight into exactly what their schedule was like at this time or what resource they did or didn't have, but we know they were hungry. They didn't have other food with them, and so they were picking of this grain, taking advantage of these accommodations that were made for them, for people in that exact position. And so I think that was understood. That was understood by people back in the day. They weren't being criticized for taking somebody else's grain, right? But I think it's important that we understand what they were doing and why they were doing it. As we get into the main thing that the topic of this first passage here, which is what they were doing on the Sabbath. Let's turn and look back at Genesis chapter 2. Because it's always important to tie this all the way back to where the Sabbath originated. Barry?
Just one quick comment.
Yeah.
Before I move on. God's attitude towards the poor is very obvious by what you just read in Deuteronomy, but we also seen that he warns them on the 7th year of the year of release, don't think the wrong way and think you get out of doing it.
Mm-hmm.
They already knew what was going to go through their heads. He warned them ahead of time. Don't think that way, you still have an obligation either way. So he knew, like he said, that they weren't going to follow it all the way, and he put some provision in there. Don't even think about helping them in the 7th year.
So I think that's something like when applying that to myself, that could be something that kind of stings, right? Because I've had conversations with some of you about things like giving, right, or like giving to the poor, right? And I know one thing that can really hurt is being taken advantage of, right? When you think that you've given to somebody and they basically cheated you out of that money because they didn't really need it, or they were going to use it for something that they were lying about what they were going to use it for. That maybe they weren't quite as needy as they said they were, or all kinds of other different circumstances as well, where I know that as humans, we don't like being taken advantage of, right? And I think but that shouldn't hold us back from being generous to others. That shouldn't hold us back from going ahead anyway, because the benefit isn't just for them, right? The benefit is for us as well. And I think that's what that principle is getting at with, just because that, sure, somebody could take advantage of you because they know, like at the 7th year, every 7 years, you're forgiven of your debts. And, across Israel, it was basically like a big reset. Right. And then what is it, every 49 years or something? Like even if you had your land taken from you because of some big debt, you would get all your land back every 49 years or so. And so there is potential in there for people to abuse that system. Just like there's potential now for people to abuse the generosity we should have. But like Barry was pointing out, like that passage was pointing out, That's no reason to harden our hearts against those who do reach out to us for help.
There's somewhere some judgment has to be made.
Mhm.
Because Paul wrote to the Thessalonians in chapter 3, verse 10, says, "For even when we were with you, this we commanded you, that if any would not work, neither should he eat." So somewhere, some judgment has to be made. You have to know the circumstances why this guy's poor. It's because he's too lazy to work. He shouldn't expect any help. We're not obligated to do that. But, like I said, we don't know the circumstances. And for our benefit, we need to be generous.
Yeah, well, right, especially when we don't know the circumstances, right? Which is like, there was no way for those Israelites to know whether or not somebody was going to pay them back before that 7-year cycle came around or something. But that shouldn't hold it back, especially if it's close, right? Somebody might say, like, it's a week away, I'll pay you back in 5 days. You know that if they just wait another couple days, that you're vulnerable to like having all that debt wiped away. But so it's that kind of thing where, because that could make us very hardened to giving any money away, to helping anyone, knowing that it puts us in a vulnerable position. But right, there are other principles that kind of govern our doing that wisely as well. Billy?
Yeah, like we had read there in chapter 15, that was talking about the law or debts and stuff like this. And the one we read in 23 was talking about the circumstances, like in Matthew. When you come along and you were hungry, you could eat for your pleasure to satisfy your hunger, but you can't harvest the field.
Right.
You just take what you want. Don't take more than you need. And of course, that applies today.
Mm-hmm.
The Pharisees, we don't know. They might have had their own law, which they did, man's law.
Mm-hmm.
They set up themselves, but they just took advantage of it here to make Jesus look bad.
Right.
Because Jesus and his disciples did nothing wrong.
Right, and that's what we're going to see as we look into this idea of the Sabbath and what things weren't to be done. That this is something they should have known. This is something they should have been open enough to have allowances for, and not just jump straight to like criticizing someone for doing what Jesus' disciples were doing. And so, what is the principle of the Sabbath? Where does the Sabbath idea come from originally?
That you perform no labor on Sabbath day.
What about even before that?
Yeah.
What's the first? Creation, right? God's the first one who took a Sabbath day, right? And that's what we read in Genesis chapter 2. Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 and 3 says that on the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done. And he rested on the seventh day from all of his work that he had done. So God blessed it. He blessed the seventh day and made it holy. He set it apart because on it, God rested from all of his work that he had done in what? That he had done in creation, right? God was busy creating, right? That's what the whole past chapter was about. That's what the next chapter is going to be about. Here in Genesis is everything that God was doing in creating and in bringing forth this fruit of his work, this masterpiece of what he created. This is what the Sabbath was about, was his resting from that. And let's remember that idea of resting from creation. So next, let's turn over to Exodus chapter 16. Exodus 16. And Michelle, this is a little bit longer of a reading. Could you read verses 22 through 30? Exodus 16, 22 through 30.
And so it was on the sixth day that they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each one, And all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses. Then he said to them, "This is what the Lord has said. Tomorrow is a Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake today and boil what you will boil, and lay up for yourselves all the remains to be kept until morning." So they laid it up till morning, as Moses commanded, and it did not stink, nor were there any worms in it. Then Moses said, "Eat that today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the seventh day, the Sabbath, there will be none." Now it happened that some of the people went out on the seventh day to gather, but they found none. And the Lord said to Moses, "How long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? See, for the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore he gives you on the sixth day bread for 2 days. Let every man remain in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the seventh day." So the people rested on the seventh day.
All right, thank you. Where was Israel at this time? They were in the wilderness. They weren't at their homes, right? They were camping around. They were God had they didn't have enough food with them, right? So how did God provide for them? Manna, right? They would wake up in the morning and what? There'd be this manna on the ground, like it says, like dew, right? And they would come and you would scrape it up, and it would be something you could like make food out of. What does manna mean? Trivia. Means what is it? that always makes me laugh when I hear about it. But there was
Verse 31
Yeah.
says, the name of manna, it was like coriander seed white, and the taste of it was like wafer made with honey.
Mhm.
It was food.
Yeah, it was food, but it was unlike anything they had ever seen before, right? And they go out and they look down and they're like, "What is this?" And you know what they named it? What is it? It's like whatchamacallit or something. I don't know. I guess we still do that today a little bit. I don't know. But right, so it was this amazing provision made for them to be able to sustain them while they were out in the wilderness. Yes. Was there a hand up back here somewhere? Oh yeah.
Not only does God provide food for them, but he fixed it for them did not get out.
Mm-hmm. Right, and we see here on this specific one, normally what would happen, and that's why we were reading some of the details. I meant to kind of preface this reading with some of this, but normally if they collected more than they needed, the next day it would rot, it would be filled with, it would just get gross, right? But here on this time, because they were to collect it so they could rest on the Sabbath day, even this was, it talks about how it was able to be left until the next day without, where was that? 24, right? So they would lay it aside until the morning, right? And it did not stink, and there were no worms in it. Well, that's nice. Right? That would be really, really gross to have that in there. But this is God providing for them, whereas what would normally happen didn't happen because they were making provision for this Sabbath day of rest. And what weren't they to do? What does it say? It says, tomorrow is a day of solemn rest. Back up in verse 23. It says, bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil. And all that is left over lay aside to be kept until morning. So there's a passage. But right, we see that even so, even being given some of this instruction, that they were that people still went out. People still went out to try to collect on the Sabbath day, and whether that's because they wanted more, whether it's because they didn't prepare the day before, we're not exactly told. But God calls them out and says, "How long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath." Right, the Sabbath was for them. Right? It was a blessing that was given to these people to be able to rest, and God talked about how to make provisions for it, and yet some refused to do so. And so that's why in verse 29, he gives you bread for 2 days, because the Sabbath is for you. Take advantage of it. It's a day to rest. It's meant to be a blessing, but yet they're turning it into a curse on themselves by not receiving that blessing, not making preparation for it. And so he finishes by saying, remain each of you in his place. Let no one go out of his place on the seventh day. So the people rested on the seventh day. And we'll see, I think, some of this instruction where he's talking about remain each of you in his place. Right? This is one of those things where the Israel of the time, or like going forward even to the time of the Pharisees and stuff, had made laws about, well, what does it mean to be in your place? What qualifies as your place exactly? And how far must you walk in order to be considered out of your place? These are all things they tried to make these regulations about and bind on everyone. So if you're still in Exodus, there's more, just a couple more references to this. In chapter 34, it talks about in these instructions that are being given. It says 6 days you shall work in verse 21, but on the seventh day you shall rest. In plowing time and in harvest you shall rest. Okay, so already we see a little bit more emphasis being put on this. This isn't just when there's nothing to do, right? This also applies when there is work to be done, right? Like in harvest time. Harvest time, the perfect day to harvest might come on the Sabbath day, but that doesn't mean that you should go out and work and reap and bring all that in on the Sabbath day. It says it applies in plowing time and in harvest. Exodus 35, the next chapter. Let's look at verses 2 and 3. It says, 6 days of work shall be done, but on the seventh you shall have a Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to the Lord. Because any work on it shall be put to death. You shall kindle no fire in all your dwelling places on the Sabbath day. Okay, so, wow, is that really? That went by so fast this time. So he makes this specific point here of shall kindle no fire, right? Why be kindling a fire on the Sabbath day? Cooking, right? Creating something, making something, right? There should be no, don't do that. Like, even if you've already collected it, don't kindle a fire in your dwelling place on the Sabbath day. Have everything already made, right? And this was the point, so they could rest. There's not like somebody working away in the kitchen while everybody else rests, right? That's not what it was supposed to be. It was to be a time where everyone rested. All of God's people rested from their creation, from their work. And this is something that people would have taken very seriously, right? Because we just read that language in Exodus 35 where it says, whoever does any work shall be put to death, right? That's serious. That makes you stand up and notice. And in Numbers 15, we read about somebody out collecting firewood, right? Out there collecting wood on the Sabbath day. They found a man gathering that in Numbers 15. And they brought him to Moses and Aaron. They weren't sure what to do with him at first, but the Lord told Moses that man should be put to death. And in verse 36 of Numbers 15, that's what they did. The congregation brought him out. They put him to death, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. Right? And that seems so strict. That seems for out gathering wood. But that was, you don't need wood to eat. Wood is, you gather wood in order to be able to make these fires, to be able to create these meals. It was casting away God's blessing that he had given to them. And it's easy when looking at things like that to see why some people might want to make laws regulating because that kind of puts some fear into you, right? It may make you think, well, that was such a little thing. And so you might want to regulate every little thing about the Sabbath, exactly how far you can go, exactly what you can touch or lift, and we know that there were many laws created, not given by God, but created by the lawyers, by the scribes, by the Pharisees, and that had to do with this, and that put a lot of regulation around these things. But what it's easy to do is to forget that, like Mark 2:27 says, is that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And so what it had turned into is the Sabbath was a burden to people. It was something that had been so regulated, so laid out in detail, exactly what you could and couldn't do, that it was a burden put on people instead of what it was always intended to be from the very beginning, from back in Genesis. It's supposed to be a blessing to them. It was supposed to be, it was made for man. We weren't made to serve the Sabbath. And so there's so much more we can get into on that, and other verses we'll look at. But Michelle, we're about out of time.
Well, those verses that you were just referencing in Numbers, it's just interesting that the two verses right before that, it says, but the person who does anything presumptuously, whether a native born or a stranger, and brings reproach against God, it's not so much about like innocently, just needing something and so you go get it. It's about defiantly disobeying the law of God. And I think that's the whole point is, if you know the rules, don't purposely go out and break them. But if you're in need, there's provisions for you.
Right. Yeah. And not to cast it aside. Right. There's, and I think that was, I don't know, the more people do that, the more there's an expectation to do that kind of thing, the further and further people are going to get from the original intent of what it was that God was doing. And that's true for them. That could still be true for us today. We're just about out of time, but maybe between now and then the next class we can think about, is it still possible today to fall into some of the same attitudes towards law, towards the requirements of God, things that God has told us that those criticizing the disciples had. Because I know for me, I'm always concerned that I'm going to be the blind one, like we read about here. Missing a lesson that should be clear, missing a principle that should be clear, but missing it for the details of how it's maybe put into practice in tradition or in something, or in just in our common interactions with one another. So, but yeah, just something to think about between now and the next class. Appreciate everyone's comments.
Well,